Jan Berry, the genius who wrote his own death scene. He wrote a song about a fatal car crash. He named the road. He named the car. 2 years later, he drove that car down that road at 80 miles an hour into a parked truck. Paramedics pronounced him dead. Then they found a pulse. He woke up 6 weeks later, unable to walk, talk, or recognize his own music. His IQ had tested above 150. He was in medical school. He had a secret son being raised as his brother. He was 25. His partner kept the act alive by posing with Jan's little brother on album covers and imitating Jan's voice on tape. He relearned language like a toddler. He got back on stage. The crowd booed. He kept going for 30 more years. He died 1 week before his 63rd birthday from a seizure, a consequence of brain damage from that truck 38 years earlier. His son never forgave him. His partner never left him. The truck never stopped killing him. It just took its time. The dates, the chart positions, and the medical records are real. What people argue about is whether the song caused the crash or just described the man who was always going to have one. This is Jan Berry's real story. The genius with the secret. William Jan Berry was born on April 3, 1941 in Los Angeles and raised in Bel Air. His father was an aeronautical engineer who had worked for Howard Hughes as a project manager on the Spruce Goose and had been aboard the plane on its only flight. His mother, Clara, was a Norwegian immigrant from Bergen. Jan was one of 10 siblings. He fell from a moving car at age 2. He was expelled from school on multiple occasions. His IQ tested above 150. He played tight end at University High School and sang doo-wop in the shower room after practice with his teammate, Dean Torrance. In his father's garage, with an upright piano and 2 Ampex reel-to-reel recorders, Jan ran sessions that produced a top 10 hit before he turned 18. A neighbor named Sandy Nelson played drums. A kid named Bruce Johnston sometimes sang piano parts. Johnston would later join the Beach Boys. Jan didn't treat music as a career. He treated it as a hobby. His career was medicine. He completed pre-med at UCLA in 1962 and entered the California College of Medicine in 1963. By the time of his accident, he'd finished 2 years of medical school. He was simultaneously dissecting cadavers and producing #1 records. But there's a detail from this period that most fans never learn, and it's the one Jan Berry spent his whole life hiding. In 1959, when John was 17 or 18, his girlfriend, Jeanette Anderson, gave birth to a son. They named him Stephen Grant Berry. Rather than raise the child, Jan let his parents adopt Steve and raise him as Jan's sibling. Steve grew up believing Jan was his older brother. The family maintained the lie for years. The genius who could hear a hit single in an unfinished demo couldn't find a way to tell his own son the truth. That silence would outlast the car crash, the brain damage, and the comeback. It would outlast everything. The song that wrote his future. Before the crash, there was the prophecy. In late 1963, Jan Berry and lyricist Roger Christian sat down to write a drag racing song. Christian wanted a straightforward race narrative. Jan insisted it end in a catastrophic wreck. He was adamant. He wanted the listener to hear tires screeching, metal crumpling, the silence after impact. The result was Dead Man's Curve, released in February 1964, peaking at number 8 on Billboard. The lyrics describe a drag race on Sunset Boulevard. They name the car a Stingray. There was a real stretch of sunset near UCLA, locally known as Dead Man's Curve, where 26 accidents, 3 of them fatal, had occurred in 2 years. Jan had raced past it hundreds of times. He later estimated he'd raced several hundred times on that road. Now here's where reality swallowed fiction whole. On April 12, 1966, Jan Berry climbed into his brand new blue 1966 Corvette Stingray, the same model named in his own lyrics, and drove down Sunset Boulevard. He just left his final appeal at the draft board. Vietnam was drafting nearly 400,000 men that year. He was heading to the Beverly Hills Hilton to discuss forming his own record label. He was 25 years old, 9 days past his birthday. He was doing roughly 80. At the intersection of Whittier Drive and Sunset, he pulled out to pass a bus and slammed full speed into a parked gardener's truck. The Corvette folded like aluminum. The steering column collapsed into his chest. His skull struck the windshield frame with enough force to cause massive brain hemorrhaging. When paramedics arrived, they looked at the body crumpled inside the wreckage and marked him dead. Then someone checked again and found a pulse. Faint, erratic, but there. They rushed him to UCLA Medical Center, the same university where he had completed his pre-med degree 4 years earlier. The blonde, handsome 25-year-old who had raced Sunset Boulevard hundreds of times would never drive again. He was unconscious for 2 weeks, semi-conscious for 2 more. The diagnosis was catastrophic: traumatic brain injury, aphasia, verbal apraxia, partial paralysis of the right side. Multiple brain surgeries followed. In June, a court granted conservatorship of Jan Barry's person and estate to his father. The man with the genius IQ could no longer manage his own name. The songwriter who had demanded his fictional driver crash on Sunset Boulevard had driven his own Stingray into a truck on Sunset Boulevard. He'd written the ending, he just hadn't known it was his. The #1 hit that started a war. To understand what the crash destroyed, you have to rewind to 1963, when Jan Barry was the most dangerous producer on the West Coast. In the summer of 1962, Jan and Dean and the Beach Boys shared a bill at a Los Angeles record hop. Jan Barry and Brian Wilson became instant friends. Wilson started singing backing vocals and doubling leads on Jan and Dean tracks. At a party in early 1963, Wilson played Jan a few songs on piano. Jan asked to record Surfin' USA. Wilson refused. That was for the Beach Boys. But he had a fragment he'd abandoned, working title, "Goody Connie, Won't You Come Back Home?" He gave Jan the track and the opening line. Jan rebuilt it from the ground up. He layered in his signature dual drummer production, restructured the arrangement, added lyrics. The result was Surf City, 2 girls for every boy. And in July 1963, it became the first surf song to reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Brian Wilson was proud. His father, Murray Wilson, who managed the Beach Boys, was livid. Murray called Jan a record pirate. He believed Brian had thrown away a #1 hit that should have gone to his own son. The Beach Boys didn't reach #1 themselves until I Get Around, a full year later. Jan Barry had beaten Brian Wilson to the top of the chart with Brian Wilson's own song. And Brian's father never let anyone forget it. Over the next 3 years, Barry and Wilson co-wrote roughly a dozen hits. Drag City, The Little Old Lady from Pasadena, Ride the Wild Surf. In 1964, Billboard ranked Jan and Dean as the 6th top singles artist of the year. 1 spot above Marvin Gaye, 1 below Elvis Presley. They hosted the TAMI show, the landmark concert film featuring James Brown, the Rolling Stones, the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, Chuck Berry, and the Beach Boys. Now preserved in the Library of Congress. 26 chart hits over 8 years. 2 college kids from West LA who outcharted nearly everyone alive. All of it. The hits, the friendships, the medical degree, the label deal, the future. Was in the blue Corvette when it hit the truck. Glenn Campbell, who played guitar on the majority of Jan and Dean's sessions, later marveled at Barry's studio abilities. Unlike his contemporaries Phil Spector and Brian Wilson, Barry personally wrote out the notation for every instrument, every chord progression, every part. Campbell called him brilliant. That brilliance was now scattered across the intersection of Whittier and Sunset. The partner who posed with his brother. While Jan lay at UCLA, relearning how to blink on command, Dean Torrance faced an impossible bind. Jan and Dean had contractual obligations with Screen Gems, which controlled Jan's artist and songwriting contracts. Dean didn't have legal authority to make deals for the act. He couldn't even use the name Jan and Dean. He tried anyway. He recorded a concept album called Save for a Rainy Day, all Rain Them songs. And for the album cover, he posed with Jan's younger brother Ken Berry in a long shot, hoping nobody would notice it wasn't Jan. He imitated Jan's voice on the recordings. Screen Gems issued a cease and desist. Columbia Records, their distributor, quietly walked away. Dean had watched his best friend nearly die, was legally blocked from keeping their music alive, and couldn't even put the right name on the records. So he pivoted. He started a graphic design company called Kitty Hawk Graphics. Over the following decade, he designed album covers for Harry Nilsson, Steve Martin, the Beach Boys, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Linda Ronstadt, and dozens more. In 1972, he won the Grammy for Best Album Cover. He could have moved on. He had a thriving second career. He had every reason to let Jan and Dean become a nostalgia footnote. But Dean Torrance never stopped waiting for Jan Berry to come back. And what came back was not what he expected. The 7-year reboot of A Human Brain. The rehabilitation of Jan Berry is one of the most extraordinary and least understood recoveries in music history. He emerged from the coma unable to walk, speak, or control the right side of his body. His right arm hung nearly useless. His face drooped. Speech therapy started from zero. Individual sounds, then syllables, then fragments of words. The aphasia meant he could sometimes think a word, but not produce it. The apraxia meant his mouth refused to form the shapes his brain commanded. He would reach for the word music, and nothing would come. He had to rebuild language the way a 2-year-old builds it, except a 2-year-old doesn't remember what they've lost. Jan Berry remembered everything. He knew what he had been. He just couldn't say it. Yet by January 1967, less than a year after the crash, Jan started gathering his pre-accident tapes and working on new material. In February 1967, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner reported a dramatic moment when Jan took the stage at a private Hollywood club. His friend was performing and called Jan up to the microphone. He made it there haltingly. Between April 1967 and October 1968, working through the fog of brain damage, Jan wrote, arranged, and produced an entire album called Carnival of Sound, a psychedelic, experimental work of startling ambition. He needed help. His speech was fractured. His right hand barely functioned. But the musical mind inside the damaged body kept producing. Warner Brothers listened to the album and shelved it. It wasn't released until 2010. 42 years later, 7 years of therapy, relearning to walk, relearning to speak, relearning the songs he'd written in a previous life. The genius hadn't died in the crash. It was trapped inside a body that refused to cooperate, sending signals through broken wiring, producing music that nobody wanted to release. And then Jan Berry decided he was going back on stage. The booing and the refusal to quit. In August 1973, 7 years after the crash, Jan and Dean made their first public appearance together at the Hollywood Palladium for a nostalgia event. They attempted to lip-sync to Surf City. The record malfunctioned. The audience booed. Most people would have taken the hint. Jan Berry was not most people. The same reckless ego that had sent him racing down Sunset Boulevard every Saturday night, the same stubbornness that had driven him to attend medical school while producing hit records, now turned itself toward an impossible goal: performing live with half a functioning body. In June 1976, a full decade after the crash, Jan joined Dean and his band Papa Do Run Run at the Palomino nightclub. He sang 2 songs, The Little Old Lady from Pasadena, and Dead Man's Curve. His voice was slurred and halting. His timing wandered. The musicians around him were extraordinarily patient, adjusting tempo and arrangement in real time to keep him inside the song. One technician who mixed sound for Jan at a rehearsal studio later recalled that Jan's singing was noticeably slowed by the crash, and that the musicians treated him with remarkable tenderness. It was the first time Jan and Dean had performed live together, backed by a band with Jan actually singing, since April 1966. Then came the TV movie. On February 3rd, 1978, CBS aired Dead Man's Curve, starring Richard Hatch as Jan and Bruce Davison as Dean. Jan himself appears briefly in the audience near the end. The movie was a rating smash and triggered a national wave of nostalgia. That summer, Jan and Dean opened for the Beach Boys on a major tour. Over the following 26 years, Jan and Dean played the Rose Bowl 4 times, Three Rivers Stadium 3 times, hundreds of state fairs, theme parks, and Las Vegas. Some nights were triumphant, some were painful to watch. Jan's speech remained impaired. His right side remained partially paralyzed. But he was on stage, slurring through the songs he'd produced with a genius ear in another lifetime, and no force on earth could make him stop. Dean Torrance served as best man when Jan married Gertie Phillip at the Stardust Resort on September 1st, 1991. They'd met at Lulu's Roadhouse, Canada's biggest nightclub. Jan was 50. He'd been partially paralyzed for 25 years. He was still performing. The son who died without forgiving him. Remember Stephen Grant Barry? The son John had given away as a teenager? The boy raised to believe John was his brother? Steve eventually discovered the truth. The discovery shattered him. He was furious at the deception that the entire Barry family had maintained for years. He never reconciled with Jan. On November 18, 1995, Steve Barry died of complications from AIDS. He was 36 years old. In photos, he bears a striking resemblance to his famous father. The same jawline, the same eyes. But the resemblance only existed in pictures. In life, the connection between father and son remained severed. Jan Barry had survived a crash that paramedics called fatal. He had spent 7 years relearning to speak. He had endured booing, paralysis, and 3 decades of impaired motor control. But the damage he did to Steve Barry required no truck, no impact, no brain trauma. It only required silence. And unlike the crash, it was something John had chosen. His son was 36. The crash had taken Jan's body. The lie had taken his son. He couldn't fix either one. 38 years of dying. The last chapter of John Barry's life is not a single event. It is a slow-motion conclusion to something that started on a sunny morning in April 1966. Seizures were a recurring consequence of the brain injury. He had taken the anticonvulsant Dilantin since the crash. His health declined through the 1990s in increments, each setback pulling him a little further from the stage he refused to leave. He released a solo album, Second Wave, in 1997. It did not chart. In early March 2004, Jan was on stage with Dean in El Cajon, California, singing the old hits. His voice was impaired. His right arm hung at his side. But he was there, still performing, still refusing to concede what the truck had taken. Dean later said there was nothing Jan cared about more than being on that stage. 3 weeks later, it was over. 3 weeks later, on March 26, 2004, 1 week before his 63rd birthday, Jan suffered a seizure at his home on Westgate Avenue in Los Angeles. He stopped breathing. His wife, Gertie, called for help. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center, the same hospital where he'd been taken after the 1966 crash, the same university where he'd once studied to become a doctor. He could not be revived. He was pronounced dead that evening. The cause was the seizure. a direct consequence of traumatic brain injury sustained 38 years earlier on Sunset Boulevard. The crash didn't kill Jan Barry on April 12, 1966. It killed him on March 26, 2004. And it just took 38 years to finish what it started. He was an organ donor. His body was cremated. He was 1 week shy of 63. The road, the song, and what remains. On April 18, 2004, a celebration of life was held at the Roxy Theater on the Sunset Strip. The same boulevard where Jan had raced hundreds of times, the same road where the truck had been parked, the same street his most prophetic song described. In 2008, Dead Man's Curve was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. The song John Barry had insisted must end in a fatal crash. The song that named his car, his road, and his fate was now a national treasure. Jan's father, who had worked on the Spruce Goose and been appointed conservator of his brain-damaged son's estate, died on December 19, 2004, less than 9 months after Jan. Dean Torrance moved to Huntington Beach and campaigned to have the city officially nicknamed Surf City, USA. He continued touring with the Surf City All-Stars. He designed the cover for the 2010 release of Carnival of Sound, the lost album Jan had produced while he could barely form words. Dean never stopped. When asked years later about the difficulty of watching Jan struggle on stage, Dean offered no complaint, no regret, just loyalty. He had waited 10 years for Jan to come back. He was never going to be the one who walked away. Jan Barry spent the first half of his life building things: hit records, vocal arrangements, a medical career, an entire California mythology. He spent the second half trying to hold on to what a parked truck took from him on a Tuesday morning. An IQ above 150. Medical school at 22. #1 on Billboard at 22. Host of the TAMI show alongside James Brown and the Rolling Stones at 23. 26. Chart hits in 8 years. A collaboration with Brian Wilson that made Wilson's own father call him a pirate. And then Sunset Boulevard collected its debt. The song said Dead Man's Curve was no place to play. Jan Barry insisted that song end in a crash. 2 years later, he drove his Stingray into a gardener's truck at 80 miles an hour. The paramedics marked him dead. He wasn't. He spent 6 weeks in a coma, 7 years relearning how to speak, and 38 years dying from the damage. He had a son he gave away. That son died at 36 without forgiving him. He had a partner who posed with his brother to keep the dream alive. That partner stood beside him for 46 years. He had a wife who married him a quarter century after the crash, when his speech was halting and his right arm hung useless. And she was with him when the final seizure came. He was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center, the hospital where they'd rushed his shattered body in 1966, attached to the university where he'd once studied to save lives instead of losing his own. The blue Corvette hit the truck, and the truck won. It just took 38 years for anyone to count it. And if you want the full story behind the Carnival of Sound sessions, the lost psychedelic album Jan Barry produced while he could barely form words, and why Warner Brothers buried it for 4 decades, subscribe. That's coming next.